Hello friends, it is I, Rob, the Dungeon Tutor, here with another masterclass for you. This one is going to be dedicated again to the Darkest Dream and running it, but this time this is for characters and for game masters who like to think outside of the box. Specifically, moving away from the pre-generated characters that come with the Darkest Dream. Now, doing that has some relatively large disadvantages. The game was clearly written with those pre-generated characters in mind. While I must say the encounters are mostly agnostic to the individual characters, they're kind of all put in a time and a place with assumed relationships between the characters and the NPCs that are involved. Most specifically, the players are going to be put into a relatively privileged space because of the trust built up by them being members of the troupe in good standing. If that isn't the case, the game master is going to have to struggle to make some of the things work. And also, the big reveal moment, the big special twist in the game is really going to be a bit more complicated if you don't actually have a character that can be the subject of the twist. Alright. From this point on, this is Game Master only. Players, if you're going to play this game, watch a different video. This one's just going to give a bunch of reveals and things that you're not going to really... Let's just face it, it's going to sink a lot of the fun of the game when you know some of the things are going to happen. So just step off. There are plenty of other videos out there to watch. Some I've made. Have fun. Alright, Game Masters, are they gone? Alright, let's begin. Okay, couple of things that are an issue. Number one, if you're going to use pre-generated characters, they're all the pieces that are already enmeshed into the storyline. If you take characters from outside of the Blue Veil troupe, it becomes a little bit more far-fetched that they're going to be involved in the plot lines of the Darkest Dream. Elements going forward beyond the Darkest Dream kind of imply your characters have a vested interest in the Hanatas in general, and the Blue Veil Troupe in specific. So, if you don't have that, a lot of the bite of this story is gone. And I'm not just talking about the fact that, you know, the pre-generated characters are more powerful, so therefore it might be harder. No, that you can take care of because the monsters all have variable statistics. And a weaker group can go up against the weaker challenges, and that's fine. No. The problem is that it becomes increasingly more difficult to involve non-Hanatas characters in this storyline. Many of the encounters assume that the player characters are themselves Hanatas, and therefore they have certain strings that can be pulled. They have certain involvements that these events are going to speak to. And if you don't have that, it's going to lose some of its appeal that you, as a game master, are going to have to work harder to recreate. So, I will give you some suggestions. I will give you some solutions. I'll tell you this. GUI Cube themselves strongly recommend your characters be Hanatas. And you can make Hanatas that aren't the pre-generated characters. That's fine. Make sure you share with your players the Being Hanatas handout, the information about the Frenta that is available from GUI Cube. That will help, and you don't need to make your character one of the 24 pre-generated characters. You can do what you want. Bear a few things in mind, however, if you do this. The Hanatas are a close-knit family. They are all aware of what's going on in each other's business. So having characters with deep, dark secrets or some form of background that is contrary to the harmony of the group should be highly discouraged. Let's face it, things are going to get scary enough that you don't necessarily want things coming in between how well the characters are going to be knit together. And if you tell the rest of the story through as it's written, some of those challenges are going to rip a lesser group apart. So that's something to think about, certainly. Also, Yes, technically all of the character classes and theoretically all of the races are on board. You know, the fact there is no Gorund, for instance, if you like the Gorund. You know, there's no reason why you couldn't make one and say he's a long ways from home and just ended up with the Hanatas. Sure, you can do that. And, you know, by following the GUI way of making characters, yeah, you can make theoretically just about anything. But, again, as a game master, you should be a part of that conversation because in such a highly narrative story, if your characters are not well tied into the story, again, you lose a lot of the punch, you lose a lot of the appeal. Your players, through their characters, should be offended every time a non-Hanatas is insulting the troop as a whole. If that isn't the case, if they're outsiders themselves, you'll lose a lot of that appeal. I still remember my players' hackles rising every time one of them was called a Shazat, which is, again, a slang term for the Hanatas that the Hanatas don't particularly enjoy. Too close to their own personal lingo, and it's used in an insulting context most of the time. So, yeah, that's kind of a problem. But, again, game balance-wise, the characters are designed to be pretty beefy, and if your characters aren't pretty beefy, you're going to have to go on the light side of the encounters. This will especially become clear when you start having encounters with things like arachnic revenants and the like, who are kind of nasty. And if the odds and the dice go against your players, that can put them in an awfully hard position. So, make sure the characters are appropriately beefy or that you use the encounters appropriate to their tactics and skills. I'm not saying that a group of fresh out of the player's handbook characters can't tackle Darkest Dream. It's just those players are going to have to work extra hard, use all of their skills, all of their tactics, in order to compensate for the fact that these encounters are kind of tough. So, and of course there are peaks and valleys to that. Obviously the combative encounters in the dungeons tend to be a little bit tougher than the NSREs. But all the same, you should be aware of the power levels of the characters. That's the first thing with making non-pre-generated characters. And, of course, too, also, be mindful of the number of people in your group. If you've only got 3 players, it doesn't make sense to use some of the default encounters because your lesser number of players are just going to get swamped. I would say definitely if you have only 3 players and you're running the Darkest Dream, keep an eye towards taming the encounters down onto the weaker end. Maybe think about pulling a couple of the monsters when they're presented with, say, 6 wolves. Only throw 4 wolves at them. If they are supposed to be taking on 5 of the lizard folk, think about throwing 4, maybe 3 of the lizard folk at them. And if they're newcomers, maybe just 2. Or 2 with a little bit of a bump up in hit points so they take a little longer to beat, but don't risk overwhelming the party with odds. At least until they're ready for that kind of thing. It's amazing what having a couple of crowd control spells can do for the power level of an encounter, so at first level that isn't exactly a thing, so bear that in mind. Of course, if you have a spellcaster, remember exactly how powerful sleep is. It can really ruin your encounters. But anyhow, I digress. So, power level is something to consider. Just kind of make sure that your characters are going to be fit for the encounter coming up, and if they are, not traditional or not typical, make sure you tailor things to that account. I mean, if you have, 3 characters and your players all are massive power gamers and they have got everything sharpened down to a science, then by all means hit them with whatever you want. But that is the game that they and you choose to play. So, have at it. So, that's the first thing. Number 2, this game will not work if your players aren't playing at least somewhat good people if they come from outside the Hanatas. Let's face it, things are about to get pretty dark for the Hanatas. And if the players are neutral or worse in their outlook, they're not going to care. What do they care if a bunch of carnies are having a bad day? That's their business. They run a carnival. They run that risk all the time. So if your characters are neutral or, even tend towards evil and stirring up the chaos themselves, there's not going to be any bite to this game. It's just simply not going to work unless you massively overhaul the thing. You would have to give the characters deep motivations to do something to involve them in the story. It's simply not going to happen. So, yeah, that's kind of an issue there that you might want to. All the characters that are pre-generated are decent folk who want to protect their family and friends. So there's no conflict there. If you're running your own outsiders, that's more of a conflict that you're going to have to deal with. Now, let me start getting to the real meat of the problem. Number one is that from the beginning to the end of the Darkest Dream, if the characters are the Hanatas, Borag and the rest of the Hanatas look at them as friends and family. They trust them. They trust them with responsibility, and they trust them with widespread access to the entire troop, and the well wishes of the entire troop go with them. If you're some scabby adventurers coming in from the outside, you might get some goodwill with some early good behavior, but you'll never be trusted on a level that characters that are from the troop themselves would ever be trusted at. Unless you're willing to make the entire group of the Blue Veil troop really, really dumb. Now, it's one thing for Borag to say, well, you saved that boy, and you saved the guard and the driver from that bear. For your good intent, we will consider you a friend of the Hanatas. You can come in without cost. You can carry weapons. We're not going to think otherwise of you because you clearly have good intentions. I will give each of you one of these tokens, which will show a little image of the holy symbol of Jinx, for instance. Each of you can have this, show it at any tent, and they will know that you are a friend of the Hanatas, and that you were the ones who helped in this, prevent what could have been a tragedy. Now see, that's something that you can do that at least gives the player characters a reason to have something to do with the actual performers of the Hanatas that isn't just, you're a townie, you're an outsider, you're one of them, not one of us. And that can help to ameliorate that somewhat. It's still wildly out of character for most of them to ever trust anyone who is not one of the Blue Veil troop with some of the things that the player characters get to do in this story. But it's at least a step. And as a game master, I guess by this time you're dialing down the xenophobia a little bit, so okay, fine. But the player characters need some way that they can get into the Hanatas' trust and confidence to be able to share even the most slender bit of this actual adventure. Sure, they can see the sights. They can bump into the encounters all you want, but as far as involving themselves, it's a bit harder. Not impossible, just harder. So, a few things to note. Number one, if I were you as a game master, if you're not familiar with clocks, and I'm not talking about the ones that keep track of time, this is a mechanic that I first learned from Blades in the Dark. Make a circle. Break it up, I would say, into sixths. Line, line, line. You're good. Like a pie. Every time the player characters do something to benefit the Hanatas, fill in a box. If it's something major, they sacrifice their lives, or they do something that puts themselves in great peril for the benefit of others, fill in 2 boxes. But when it's all the way full, the Hanatas now know that these people are friends of the Hanatas fully and can trust them with anything other than the secrets of the troop. And which there's not a great deal in this story, so they'll miss some of the nuances, sure, but at least they'll have a reason to be the person that the group looks to. So, once they get that sixth box filled in, you can pretty much trust them that the group will be trusted with the comings and goings of the people and around. Don't get me wrong, I'm not going to say that every NPC's approach is going to be the same. For instance, the spell dancers are probably not going to have quite as big of a smile for what seem to be just decent folk. They'll give them the professional smile, but not the warm smile of, hey, you know, I'm your big sister and we're looking out for you. Another option you could have is, and this is kind of an interesting one for me, but erase all of the player characters except for the ones that you created. None of them exist. Theros, Brandel, all of them gone. No Carlos. None of them gone. A little bit harsh? Yes, but now the Hanatas need young folk to do all those things that aren't performing. They need to hire somebody. Okay, so now they don't have a young generation of the Frenta around, just a couple of non-combatant Frenta. They need somebody to guard them. They need somebody to do a patrol. Maybe they had a tragedy and they lost all their youngsters. But now Boreg has to open up the purse strings and hire the player characters to do security. That means as a game master, you're going to have to change the wording on almost all the encounters because there's not friendly smiles, you're hired help. And that is a way that you can be still involved in the security aspect of it, sure. And if you go through all the different encounters, by the time it's done, they'll be, respected as decent at their job at security. But it's not the same. And again, the characters probably should not be welcomed to the very open embrace of the troop. That's not their nature. That's not the nature of any group that would be like the Hanatas, keeping outsiders at a distance because everybody else they're so used to everybody else being against them. A troop that opens themselves up to passerbys and random folk is a group that's going to end up gutted at the side of the road. So there's realistic expectations that your players do have ways of getting in besides just paying for a ticket. And if you really want to get rid of any connection to the Hanatas and make it hard mode for them to do some of these encounters, let them just buy their ticket and be a townie. You're really going to miss out on all of the stuff that makes this adventure special, but now it's become a series of disconnected adventures that you can have in a carnival. It's not perhaps the best if you really love narrative storytelling and a good reason to want to involve yourself in all of this. No, they could just be adventures that are in the wrong place at the wrong time and happen to have the skills that can make a situation better. Sure. But then you're going to have circumstances that, again, some of these encounters aren't going to make sense unless your characters are terribly nosy and love throwing themselves into encounters that they really don't have a stake in. For instance, if your party comes across the paladins led by Jillian, who want to start tearing down the carnival, they'd be like, "Hey, wait, don't be a jerk," But it's not like they have a stake in this. If the stuff comes down, maybe their fun is lost, but it's not like they're a member of the troop that should be outraged. They're getting ready to destroy their wagons and their displays and start throwing people out by their hair. No. This is just, wow, this sucks for them. I'll go and tell somebody from the carnival so they can stop this, maybe, but it's not the same. So you're going to have to tweak that a little bit, right? Maybe instead of paladins, you make them anti-paladins. Sure. Paladins is some evil god who've come in to just cause chaos and carnage. Little bit of a tweak here, little bit of a tweak there, and most of the encounters can be done so that a party can come in at the right time without necessarily having to be of the Hanatas. That can happen. This is going to be more work for you, Game Master. And I'm not going to go encounter by encounter by encounter. If you have a hard time converting an encounter so that an outsider group realistically could get drawn into it, fine, contact me and we can have that discussion. But realistically, I'm just prepping you for the difficulty you're having simply because you're not using Hanata's characters. You're just having people come from the outside. So if you're going to involve them deeply, that's the kind of hard part you're stuck at, right? Okay. Now, that's just a matter of involving your characters, putting them in the right place at the right time to have these different encounters. And let's face it, almost all of the different tents and displays have some sort of an encounter. It will really make a person who plays it feel like this is the craziest day ever, with all of these different encounters that go on. Not all of them are bad, not all of them lead to combat, but, you know, it's busy. It's very busy and very compressed, to the point where I stretched it out over 2 days in my run through. And you might find that to be more palatable too, especially if you, say, you have a wizard who wants to take an hour break so that they can get their spell back. Yeah, that's fine. But it is something to be aware of, that it's going to be a bit compressed, and the realistic expectation of just an outsider party finding all of these encounters and finding that the Hanatas trust them to help them take care of these problems becomes more and more far-fetched the farther along it goes. So, like I said, you're going to have to twist all these encounters so they don't seem like they're connected, so they don't seem like only the player characters just happen to be there that happen to have the skills to take care of the situation. It's something you're going to have to tweak, Game Master. So, that's the kind of the superficial level, just to make you aware there's a lot of things you're going to have to change if you want the players to have an in-depth and intertwined experience that brings them to the heart of the story. And if you don't have that, you know, you're basically going to be parsing out this adventure an encounter at a time to give your players something to do, which isn't a bad thing, not at all. Some of these encounters and some of these little dungeonettes are actually pretty cool if you set them by themselves, but you lose the overarching context and the web of connection that you let the players form by these adventures. And without that, yeah, then they are just individually pretty cool things, but without that context, that makes them even better. Your players are going to be settling for having this encounter and this encounter and this encounter and nothing to go between them. Just, wow, this is a crazy day at the carnival. So, it's harder, but not necessarily impossible. And it occurs to me, you could use the fact that all these things seem to happen to tug at the supernatural background that all of this is placed against. The backdrop of Mother Savensa and the supernatural elements that are going to be taking place throughout. Not least of which, again, Game Masters only, right? If you're a player, this is not good for you to listen to, but, you know, you do you. The whole deal with the Attuned and the Mugda. Okay? The core element that starts to set the events of the Red Start Rising in place. The thing that makes this an element of destiny and supernatural. The thing that really takes the horror element of the game and plugs it in. Without that, you lose a lot in terms of the suspenseful horror that this game works so hard to build up. So, how do you resolve that? Well, it occurs to me that a lot of that is actually beneficial. The supernatural backdrop, Mother Savensa, and some of the other characters with supernatural abilities all have a chance to bring outsiders in, right? All it takes is a reading from Mother Savensa. You are destined to be with a cast-off group, outsiders, who trust none, but they must find themselves placed into your hands to redeem and perhaps to save, or to cast into oblivion. And if you do so, make sure that you give her a familiar like a cat, because cats are awesome. Especially black cats. Black cats are cool. In case you don't know her, this is magic. She is my familiar. But Mother Savensa can fix a lot of what would seem to be ridiculous levels of circumstance that all these things happen to the player characters. Just by her saying, this is destiny, this is the workings of Jinx and Kismet. Well, if that's the case, then there's kind of a divine mandate that these things are happening. And this is all to shape up the player characters so that they can participate in the festivities. Hi. But if you do not involve them in some way like that, then it just seems like it's a contrived mass of encounters that are thrown at your player characters. If you use Mother Savensa, then you can make it seem like this is not normal, but it is put upon us because it's what the divines favor. It's what can be read out of the whispers that she gleans and her visions that she gets. And then things get a little bit easier, don't they? Now the player characters are on the guard looking for ways to fulfill their destiny, possibly. Or they could say it's hogwash, but all these things keep drawing them in. And so, therefore, now all of the encounters and all of the build-up seem to make sense within the context of the supernatural. Which, again, the supernatural and D&D do go hand in hand together quite well. The other thing, too, that becomes very important is that you really start mastering the ability to make your player characters care about something, or about someone especially. Because if they're not of the Hanataz, it really doesn't have any impact if one of them is the Muugda. Having one of them be the attuned is cool. Hey, psychic powers, awesome. No big impact there. Although the person who is the attuned is definitely going to have a different time than someone who is not. But if somebody, for instance, is the Muugda, their experience is going to drastically change through the course of the story, especially after you get outside of the darkest dream and move on, and beyond the foulest of spirits even. That's when things start to really roll for that person who has been chosen to be the Muugda. If one of the player characters is not the Muugda because nobody wanted to be in the Hanataz, some of that connection is lost. A large slice of that connection is lost. So you, Game Master, have the challenge of bringing that back, if you care at all about that. And if you don't, you're just running this for the encounters then, aren't you? But if you want the players to care, if you want them to be immersed, you want them to have a personal stake in how things go, so that they themselves are driven to go along this story that you're unfolding before them, a big part of that is the Muugda. And the fact that you have somebody who is not supposed to, or at least the very fact that they have these powers and these visions is anathema to the Hanataz and presages a disaster. If you don't have that connection, you need to forge something like that if you're going to keep going in the storyline, for the player characters to really have that stake. That's going to mean you get to make a Muugda. They should probably be an NPC. Somebody the characters bump into and like. And it should be somebody that you would not expect. Now, I recommend a young and vulnerable Frenta. And there are a few. Look through the cheat sheet that's provided with the Darkest Dream for all of the different Hanataz that are not player characters. And you'll see there's a couple there that are Frenta that aren't given stats. They're not meant to be combative. They're only meant to be on the scene. They're there to fill in names for you. If you need a quick NPC to be there, a sympathetic ear, or somebody to send a message or something. But there's a couple in there that might not be too bad. And honestly, if you really want to get down to it, you might even use one of the youngsters, the children. And you might take one of those tots, one of the boys, make them the Muugda. That I'm not as excited about because it's going to put a child into danger, and some people have issues with that. I myself would never do that. But I'm not telling you how to run your game. I'm just giving you some advice. And that does instantly make that person much more sympathetic. So, it all comes down to how you're going to overcome these obstacles. Which again, are sidestepped with the pre-generated characters addressing these issues. But, as a game master, these are things that you have to think about. So that's all the different things that you have to think about to alter your game to make it fit into the Darkest Dream. Now there's a couple of good resources that you have on hand. Remember, the player characters aren't going to have all of their needs fulfilled by the troop. So, if, for instance, your starting group, say your fighter, is running around in leather armor, much like Haranen, the proud warrior of the pre-generated characters, and they want to go and they want to get better armor because they just went through a dungeon and those bloody arachnic revenants just absolutely fang the daylights out of them. So they want better armor. What do? Well, they can't go to the Hanatas. They're not going to just say, hey, yeah, of course, here, have a suit of armor. No, they're probably not just going to give them a suit of armor. Money becomes more of an issue to you. So they're probably going to have to run back to town, to Nevermore, which is not fully mapped out, realistically. However, some of Nevermore comes to you in terms of Seller's Row. You have the blacksmith, who's there. You have the alchemist, who's there. Probably two of the professions that adventurers appreciate the most. And they can bring their wares and actually have some of their wares right there at the Carnival. So they don't have to go running into town. They could buy those things still at the Carnival. And that means that you can charge them the exact rates that you think are fair and will tax the players' resources, but not completely stifle them. Sure, you could do that. Absolutely. If you do run it for multiple days, the players can't sleep with the Hanatas. That's more trust than is almost believable. But they can get rooms in Nevermore. If it's not outlined in that summary in the Game Master's Guide, make it up. It doesn't really say exactly how big Nevermore is. It doesn't say that it isn't a place that can't support 3 inns, for example, and 2 taverns, and the church appropriate to the cleric of the game. Yeah, I know. Supposedly Nevermore is going to get fully detailed in a later chapter, but at least for right now, it's your Nevermore, so deal with it as you will. That would be my recommendation. The party gets done with their day's duties. The troop is closing everything down. They don't really feel like gambling into the wee hours of the morning. So they go back to town to get their 8 hours of rest, get refreshed. So they go to the inn at Nevermore. You're fine. That's a good resource to draw back on and use. You're cool. As far as actual cash, the amount of wealth that you can get is gleaned, a few gold here, a few gold there, and a couple of decent payoffs, but not a large amount of money. For a group that is not of the Hanatas, I would recommend doubling the amount of money that they find. This will help them to cover their basic day-to-day costs, as well as give them the possibility of feeling like they have earned enough to get a couple of trinkets that will help them out down the road. Especially things like healing potions can be really useful. Also bear in mind that several of the NPCs, of the Hanatas, do give the player characters things for their missions. It is appropriate that those things include the healing potions they would give them and so on. Not out of necessarily this case charity for members of their own family, but also they want these jobs to get done. They don't want the player characters to die doing them. So it makes sense they would be a bit more generous. But as far as just doubling the amount of coins they find, it's an easy way to balance the books. It also allows them to spend a little bit and feel like they can really upgrade their characters throughout this very first adventure, which is a nice feeling. Again, if you're going to use the milestone leveling system that they recommend, frequent feelings like you're improving yourself are very useful to keep the players invested. So, doubling the cash allows them to buy the things that they want. Giving them Nevermore gives them another opportunity for buying things that aren't just in the Carnival. And that helps tremendously. But another thing that you can do, too, is for the reward for any action done inside of the Carnival to be repaid with vouchers. You know, give them drink vouchers so that they can get a couple of mugs of winterberry mead. You know, give them a voucher for a free bowl of winter pudding. or whatever you've mixed up, or any of the dishes that are already in the book. This way, you let the players feel like they're getting something that doesn't just have a gold piece value, but is still valuable. And then, when your players go off and their characters eat well and heartily, give them advantage on the next die roll they make. It's a nice little way of saying, good job, you've helped out these people, they're helping you in the humble, close to the earth ways that are appropriate for folks who work in a carnival and don't necessarily have lots and lots and lots of coin to dump on you. Remember, they do make a fair amount of money from these, but there's a lot of expense to running these carnivals. Repairing everything, feeding the troop. So they should never seem like they're gaudily wealthy. So they would repay people in small ways in keeping with the services that they offer. And if you're not part of the family, then offering these rewards makes sense as a way of rewarding outsiders for helping them. It's a way of repaying hospitality with hospitality rather than just break it down to a financial transaction. And also, take advantage of some of the other opportunities that non-Hanataz characters might give you. For instance, some of these side quests are a lot easier for non-Hanataz to do than the player characters themselves if they were all Hanataz. For instance, when my characters went off into the Old Well encounter, which they did, they went all the way through it, it was good, they came back, expended all of their spells, and were exhausted. They went off first thing in the morning on the closing day of Carnival. So they got back wiped clean. And I knew there was going to be a long day of encounters yet. So I had to come up with something on the fly so that these characters could do something. So they got yelled at. Borag and Kalnase came up and they gave them both barrels because they foolishly endangered themselves and endangered the rest of the troop too, because they went off without telling anybody, and who knows what they might have awoken. And it was very close to the camp, which means that whatever would have spilled out if they had been overwhelmed could have come back and hurt people in the camp, if not killed them. So that was a big deal, and they didn't ask any of the elders for advice or input on whether or not they should go, which they probably would have been denied. They probably would have sent somebody with more experience than a bunch of first-level adventurers. So they snuck away, and they got yelled at. Well, if your characters aren't Hanataz, then they can do that, and they can do whatever they like. Come back completely exhausted and drained and whatever, and then they'll have to deal with the slings and arrows there, but all the same, they're not going to get yelled at. There's no expectation that they need to save resources for anything else. They just went through an adventure, and now they can kick back and enjoy the Carnival. More or less. So, that does make things a little bit easier. You can slip in side quests and the like, and the player characters aren't going to have to excuse their absence from the rest of the troop. Honestly, it's a pretty light yoke. I think if you're being fair about it, it can be a pretty light yoke. What I did is I took advantage of the opportunity to enact a forbidden Hanataz ritual that I just made up to basically let the player characters have their spell slots back, with some extra dice rolling added to add some tension to it. And actually, one of the characters, if you roll dice, the absolute worst case scenario or the best case scenario could happen. The worst case scenario happened, and what happened was I just kind of interpreted things, and the person who was the victim of the whole thing, of course, was the bard of the group. And so the bad thing that happened with this transformative magical effect is that his tongue actually transformed into silver. So he actually became silver-tongued. And that's going to be the moniker that will stick with Crendon for the rest of this campaign, which I think adds an extra level, an extra dimension to his character, and doesn't hurt his character at all. So that's the kind of thing that you can do on the fly with this fantastic storyline and all of the magic and wonder of Xayathay and the Darkest Dream. These are things that are skills that a game master can work on, but these are just suggestions. It's up to you to find your own style, and when these problems come up, you can deal with them. But if you have questions along the way, please feel free to reach out to me. which you can do in the comments below, or you can fire off a message directly to me. Go to the Dungeon Tutor group, send me a message, whatever you'd like. I'm easy to get a hold of. And if you have any real significant concerns, at the very least, bring it up to the GUI community if any you found any problems. And somebody's probably also had that problem and can try to help you out with it. But I'd love to have first crack at that because, like I said, I think I know this world pretty well by now. So, can you run non-Hanataz characters through the Darkest Dream? Yes. Are there extra problems? Are there extra concerns? Is there more work for you as a game master? Yes. Involving them and enmeshing them and immersing them in the storyline gets a bit trickier and requires more work from you as the game master. But can it work? Absolutely. So, those are my ideas. Those are some little things that I've found that might help you out. Hopefully, this reaches you at a point where you are excited and ready to go into the Darkest Dream with your players. And with that little bit of preparation, you too can make it one of the most immersive and exciting adventures they've ever been on. So, I certainly hope you do that. This ends this session. I am Rob, the Dungeon Tutor, and hopefully you've enjoyed this, learned a few things, come up with some ideas on your own. And again, if you have anything else that you'd like to talk about or have discussions about, even if it's not the Darkest Dream, feel free to leave it in the comments of any of my videos. I always find them and respond to them, and they may end up leading me to make another video for you. So I strongly encourage that. Of course, if you did find this to be useful, like, subscribe is great, but the comments and the dialogue is what I crave far more. So, if you don't want to reach me through YouTube, feel free to go on Facebook at the Dungeon Tutor group. You can find me there. And if you want to send anything directly to me, through there you can find any number of posts, and you can directly message me, Rob Gustafson, at your leisure. Give me 1 or 2 days to respond, but we'll get you some help, or we'll give you some advice or something like that. And if you just want to talk about how you got around any of these circumstances, feel free to leave it in the comments. I'm not the only person with great ideas out there, and we'd love to hear other ones. So, until that next session, thank you very much for joining me tonight, and farewell.